back to the Laundry for another episode. Today we have a very special guest who actually reached out to us because he had heard the podcast. So if anyone else wants to do that, that please do. But welcome, Louie. Louie, why don't you tell us a little bit about yourself and your background?
So my name is Louie Vargas. I am born and raised in New York City. I don't know if you could tell from my accent. It's not a traditional Brooklyn accent, but it's kind of a mix of Manhattan and Brooklyn. My grandparents are from Puerto Rico, so that explains my Hispanic last name. Um, Talking about my background in compliance, it started around 8 or 9 years ago at JP Morgan, one of the big US firms, and I bounced around a little bit, not too much. I worked also for Agriculture Bank of China, Deutsche Bank, and now I'm currently in Copenhagen working for Danske Bank.
So you work within the field of like sanctions, and PEPs and sanctions is definitely a term that a lot of people have heard about, but why don't you explain sanctions to us? Like, what is it?
You kind of hear the term sanctions and embargo. They literally mean the same thing, just in different kind of context. So when you're talking about economic sanctions, it's focusing more on commercial and financial penalties that countries would impose on other countries or groups of people to, or even individuals, to kind of get them to go along with the quote unquote program, right? To stop doing something that they feel doesn't align with, another group's or country's ideals. And I say ideals because that's a catch-all, right? Um, in talking about kind of one of the oldest sanctions programs that's currently still going out on is the Cuba-US embargo, right? So um, the biggest issue there was that Cuba is communist, right? So that's why I say it could be ideal based also. But sanctions it could be levied for different reasons, right? It could be for military reasons, social issues, political issues. Now you're seeing more with human rights issues with the Magnitsky program. So there could be many different avenues why a country would do this, and this is to prevent physical warfare, right? So they want to, do certain things to kind of limit physical or human impact, and still gain the same or similar results that they would with the traditional type of warfare. Embargo again is similar vein, except embargo strictly looking at trade, right? So um, how you could say that is also in the context of like North Korea or Iran, right? We don't want no goods going in there, right? And not just US, but now it's overreaching into, secondary sanctions, right? We could potentially, OFAC could potentially, sanction other entities for interacting with these other countries in certain ways. So it could be, again, monetary, it could be trade. Um, so those are kind of the buzzwords that you hear with sanctions. How PEP is kind of different is because as politically exposed persons, so that's focusing on how, and I'm oversimplifying this, but in my mind, the really big importance with PEPs is the fact that you want to have a better control over bribery and corruption, right? To me, they go hand in hand because, lack of a better term, right? The more power you get, the more people tend to abuse it, right? So different financial companies use the PEP program in different ways. Um, some use what the country gives them as a protocol. Some financial institutions have their own metrics, which means like, the president of every country, yes, you would think they hold the same power, but if you look at the country's power amongst all the world powers, it's different rankings, right? So you might rank different presidents differently. Similarly with mayors, right? The mayor of New York City has millions of people that report to him that he's overlooking. And then you compare it to, let's say, Denmark, right? Which the city of New York has more people than the country of Denmark. Like, which one would you say it's more kind of susceptible to corruption, right? I mean, these are very hypothetical questions. I'm not picking on Denmark or New York, but just to give you a picture, right? So different FIs would rate these different positions differently so they could monitor their accounts to make sure that, okay, the money that comes into their accounts or leaves their accounts, does it make sense? Is it in line with their KYC, know your customer? Um, so yeah, they're different. Sometimes these two departments get bucketed together, but now that you're seeing more special attention being paid to sanctions, there's more of a delineation.
So, okay, just to kind of recap the sanctions. So, countries, people, organizations, they
Yeah,
end up on different sanction lists for a variety of reasons. But, like, why are these lists important?
important for different reasons. I mean, you could say, let's look at the LFAC, for example, because they have very defined programs. I mean, the EU
So,
and the
what is
UK
the
do
LFAC
as well.
for those who don't know?
So basically, they're run by the Department of Justice out of the United States. I guess you could call them the leader in sanctions prevention in the world, right? And why I say that is because they have the overreaching, well, they've given themselves the overreaching power because the US oversees the SWIFT network that they could impose sanctions as they feel fit. And what happens is, let's be honest here, they get our EU partners and UK partners upset because we do some things that's not really in line with them. But now there's starting to be more communication and alignment there. But OFAC was the first, I think, governmental body that was formed right after September 11th to really take sanctions seriously and be proactive, not just reactive, which you see with the UN that the EU takes kind of takes their lead from at times. Um, so yeah, all that to say is OFAC is kind of seen as the sanctions police, and some of the other programs try to align just to make sure they're all on the same page. So going back to your original question, why is this important? Um, OFAC, like I said, they have different programs, so they bucket the listed entities, individuals into these different programs to make it easier to kind of, make it justifiable, I would say. So you have, the narcotics traffickers, you have human rights, you have terrorist lists, and then just the catch-all list, right? So I think, all that to say is the importance behind it is that this is how the United States is trying to affect change from these different parties to say, you're doing something we don't like, we're going to, you know, say you can't, we won't do, the United States will not do business with you. And if any other country or, individual or entity does business with you in a different country, oh, we're going to consider sanctioning them too because, we want to really stick it to you. So, yeah.
This sounds like really complex, but so how do banks really work to adhere to these sanctions lists today? Like how do you do that?
I think you're the first person who ever said that sanctions is complex. What I usually hear is that sanctions is easy because it's list based. And I hear that a lot from my AML partners. Oh, we have to look at these scenarios. You in sanctions, you get a hit and it's a match or not, and you're done. But you clearly see that sanctions is very difficult, right? Because it's not only the list that you have in front of you, but you got to determine if you have enough data to determine if it's an actual match or not. You might have to ask for more information, especially with the implementation of sectoral sanctions. That made sanctions even more difficult. So sectoral sanctions started pretty much when Russia invaded Crimea, right? So what we said is, oh, as a penalty for that, we're going to sanction certain industries. And how they did that was trying to really make it painful for Russia to say, okay, these industries are important to you. We're going to make it so that if somebody's lending you money within a certain time frame, or doing business with you for certain commodities in a certain time frame, we're going to make that not allowable for the U.S. and in turn some other areas.
Like for instance, if a company in Russia wants to buy something for a supplier from the US, for instance.
Yeah, I mean, it depends on the industry, but let's say, there's different directives. There's four, if I'm not mistaken, and they focus on different industries. So there's the financial industry, energy, even drilling and stuff like that. So what you see imposed is that, okay, if you have a loan with an American bank, it cannot exceed, let's say, 14 days of repayment or something like that, right? So now, if you're seeing a transaction come through, It's not as simply saying, "Oh, this is a hit on the bank and this Russian bank and we got to stop it." No, now you got to ask for the documentations behind it to see if it's falling within the allowable or breachable time frame. So you get more nuanced in these cases, and now you're seeing that with Belarus too, from the EU side, which is quite interesting.
So it is actually a bit more complex, and it's not just lists, because like the business world is a big network of companies and individuals and
Yeah.
within different industries. But do you see any sort of new technological trends associated with sanctions, or any like new types of solutions or that could help solve this?
I think what has to be remembered here is that there's no silver bullet, meaning that nothing is perfect. Different tools could do the same thing, but they might be better at certain things than others. So I think it's you just have to really keep in mind what's best for your company and what's fit for what you could make as fit for purpose as possible. As far as new things or technology that's really helping financial crime and sanctions is I would say targeted matching, to help reduce false positives, so that humans could concentrate on the real risk and not, the junk that sometimes we see. Because the filters that we use now has like fuzzy logic. So
More entity resolution and AI and these types of things.
exactly, machine learning for decision reapplication, that could be where you know, the machine is monitoring how you respond to certain alerts. So then if it meets certain criteria, it could suggest to the user, oh, you've done this X amount of times. This could be your outcome. It's never, I shouldn't say never, but I don't think we're getting to the point where machines would just do things automatically because there's so much gray area in what we do. Like you said, it's complex. Usually when you program machines, it's to do very black and white things, right? Yes and
Mm.
no. When it comes to this gray area, I think you still need humans to fact check the machine is coming up with the right outcome.
That's
Yeah.
really what we believe in at Strise as well. It's more about, using AI to help like sift through the world's information so that people can become
Right.
better decision makers instead of people having to do all of that like gathering and sorting, but more about them doing the actual decisions and controlling the machine. But Frederick, you work with like a lot of banks and see a lot of technological trends. Like, what's your take on this?
No, I think Louis is absolutely right. It's not a, it cannot become a black box solution. You need to have humans looking into the end results, being able to track whether or not the machine did actually do what it was supposed to do, and that's why it cannot be binary, and that's why machine learning, having humans at the end product, being able to verify certain outcomes is so crucial on this. And we see that on our both on a technological scale, but also from a regulatory perspective as well.
Mhm.
There's luckily enough no banks that we've seen at least who's fully automated these processes, and the reason for that is because they need humans to be able to look at the end results. Now, what machines can do and are doing through AI, for example, in ML, is that they are able to reduce the false positives and provide less of the number of results humans have to run through at the end of the process.
We're talking about humans and machines. Like, what does a day to day job look for you? Like going through all of this and working with this.
Yeah, and the role that I have now at Danske Bank, it's quite varied. I'm part of the controls and technology team, so it's different from the more operational roles that I used to do, where I was looking at transactions every day or looking at responses for information every day, and trying to get through a certain amount. Now, I would say I'm working more on projects, so that's been a shift for me. Trying to enhance certain things that we have going on with the bank, making sure it's fit for purpose. Also talking to different stakeholders around the bank to make sure that they keep sanctions in mind if they're building something out or if they're trying to tweak something. Don't forget the risk that's involved. So even though I sit with sanctions, I'm also kind of a general risk practitioner, you might be able to call it, because I try to raise red flags that might be foreseeable throughout financial crime, not just sanctions. And I think what we've seen in the past is that people they kind of tend to stay siloed, um, and not step on each other's toes. But I think if you seen risk in different areas, you should raise your hand because that's only going to make the process better. So in a given day, I could be approached, like I said, by first line. They have a question about list management, how to, refine something on an internal watch list that won't cause more risk, but make sure that our systems or filters are capturing it. It could be, a new tool that we're trying to implement, and they want to make sure that, you know, it makes sense what it's doing. And or sometimes I'm pulled into ad hoc projects where we're discussing, virtual currency, or we're discussing, the current issue with Russia and the Ukraine, how we're going to handle it. So it's quite varied, and
Yeah, how are you going to
yeah.
handle that?
That's a good question. We're still talking about it. We're still talking to our partners in the first line and the operations team. We're still talking about it with other stakeholders just to get on the same page to make sure that if this does happen, we have a plan in place. Um, it's hard to say, right? Russia is unpredictable. We know what the threat is. We know what potential mitigating action would be from the US. We don't know much from the EU or the UK. So we're just planning on that, right? The US has said they're threatening to remove Russia from the SWIFT network.
What will that mean if they're removed from the SWIFT network? Like in practice, what would that imply?
That means all Russian banks wouldn't be able to transact over the SWIFT network. So no money will flow in and out of Russia over the SWIFT network, which, if you think about it, is not just detrimental to Russia, it's detrimental to a lot of different countries because we're so intertwined with the business that goes on in Russia. So at face value, it sounds easy, but it's going to be difficult. And it's not even because if you look at a financial institution, right, they have certain correspondent relationships with different banks, right? But let's say you take that out of it. You just look at your customer base, right? You could have millions of customers, right? Who out of that customer base has business in Russia, is doing business with Russia? I
Mm.
think that's where you're going to see the biggest impact is the customers of the financial industry who cannot now transact with them. Russia and China, it's been very well documented that they're working on workarounds to this. They have been. They continue to
What
work
type of
around it.
work? What type of workarounds?
Different payment networks. So they're looking at, not only for internally in their country, but even between them two, being the biggest, I guess you could call communist powers, so they could maintain that flow of funds amongst each other. And China has been threatened by the United States and other countries before, so I think that's why they're also looking into it. They also don't want to depend on anybody else, which we know it's a big Chinese value from we've seen throughout history. So yeah, I think it's been a big agenda for them to come up with something. Then now they partnered with Russia, and you also could see that they're looking into virtual currencies, which is part of the technology world that we see. But now with this whole craziness of ransomware and now sanctions being levied on these exchanges, I don't think virtual currency is the way to go anymore now that more attention is on it. So I think it would be more of backdoor workarounds. You're going to see Russian entities hiding behind other entities to do their business. Um,
Mm.
I guess you could say, maybe Russian companies that have ties to Chinese companies, right? They might use them to do their business. Who knows? That's why I'm saying it's so unpredictable.
How do we combat this?
That's the million-dollar question, right? I mean, how do we, I mean, KYC is always the name of the game, right? We got to know who our customers are, who our customers are, right? KYCC. But that's not everything. I think it's going to come to a point where if this does happen, we're going to have to ask a lot of questions around Russian payments, or we know, could be, I guess, Russian friendly payments, like Belarus, right? They might decide to help out their partners. Who knows? There could be so many different things. So I think what we would have to focus on is the threat that we know about, and then from there, see if there are any other red flags that we would have to manage, and then, try to put something in place to capture that.
But how do you go about like figuring out if Russia is hiding behind like layers and layers
Mhm.
of other entities? Like how do you do that? Or perhaps I don't know if
Yeah,
there is a trend with more and more data becomes publicly available.
exactly.
Like we're from the Nordics and everything is publicly available, but this
Yeah.
trend is so strong. So is that something you think will help combat this or
Yeah, so going back to the technology question, I think, now that data is more readily available, or now it's able to be,
like
uh, you know,
public
you
sources, like public registries
right.
and so
So you're
forth?
throwing all this data at a machine, and the machine could sift through it quickly and tell so you could ping this system and this third-party providers, you being a new one as well, who could kind of
Yeah.
provide that clarity to somebody to say, okay, I need to know about this company. Tell me about them, right? So Strise could say, this is a Norwegian company. This is who they're owned by, XYZ, right? You have other data providers that do that for more, world global companies. Excuse me. You also have companies that focus on sanctions data, right? Who could draw lines of comparison between one company and another, even though on the, let's say, um, like from face value, you can't see how they're connected, but with enough data, you could see, oh, by the way, this director of this company, oh, he sits on the board of this other company. Oh, okay, that's interesting. I wonder if they're actually doing more business together and stuff like that. So it is very tricky, but again, it's you try and look at through all the data and trying to figure out what kind of parallels they could be.
Network data is going to be crucial on this, I think, especially just looking through the entities of who is the bodies in charge of the companies.
Mhm.
Now there's such a huge pressure being put on the workers doing this as well, because
Yeah, the
if
frontline workers.
yeah,
Yeah,
the
huge
people doing
backlog.
this operationally,
Yeah.
because it's a gray area, and you need number one really to know your subject to be
Mhm.
able to subject out which sanctions list should you be targeting, and to what degree does a universal beneficial owner actually have sort of the majority voting power or
Right.
power in a company. But I also think that this is where network models is the
Mhm.
solution, where we're able to set rules as a base point, and then we're able to track through history, through machine learning, what ends up being the truth. And you can do that
Mhm.
with not as much data as people think you'd need. You
Mhm.
just need some input, and then the second input will start to be relevant to the first one. So,
Mhm.
say that you have one bank getting sort of notified, for example, 5,000 cases through a year. That would be a lot of data to work on for year number two, to be able to see that this is again companies or entities we need to really deep dive and look into. And this is probably a shell company, for
Mhm.
example, because we see trends of both the internal data being able to provide this is the revenue it produces compared to other players in similar industries and so forth. So you could use the relevance model to track who is the universal beneficial owners and so forth.
Yeah, I think you're highlighting the importance of KYC again, right? Because we have to know, and we have to have accurate data, right? So it's not just when they first sign up with the bank, oh, okay, that's all we need, right? It's a continual renewing of that information, a continued fact checking that information. So yeah, I agree.
I see that we're approaching sort of where we need to round the episode off, but to give an endpoint, three things that banks would need to work on more operationally. In short, what would your suggestions be, Louis?
I think data is one of them. I've seen that issue across the different banks I worked for. Good data, clean data, but also I don't want to suggest a central repository, but there has to be a way that everybody in the bank could access the data that they need to do their jobs and make it easier. There's so much you see today with acquisitions of different companies where they keep those data lines separate, and then when a regulator comes in and says, "Oh, or do you have a full view on this?" And of course the answer is no, then they rush to try to bang it all together. So I think a better foresight into getting data integrated and then having it accessible for the different units that need it to do their work. Another thing is technology. What I see too much today is that so. so many different times I hear that compliance, you're just a cost center. You're not revenue generating. And so that what does that mean? Sometimes we don't get paid great. Well, we get paid pretty good, but not great. But also, when you talk about technology, what happens is um, we get outdated technology, or we know there's certain gaps. They put band-aids on it. That's not going to last a long time. We need to get better technology. We need further investment to get, again, ahead of things, to be more proactive, not always reactive. And I would say you said three things. I think the next thing um, to guess get a better handle on is virtual currencies and ransomware. And I put those two together, even though they're kind of similar in a way where the risks are, because how do people pay ransomware? Usually through virtual currency. So that's why I kind of tied them together. Also because now we're seeing that a lot of these um, companies that are or these hacking companies are being sanctioned now. So now that's a sanction. Why? It's a big deal for me, but still, throughout financial crime, it's a big deal. But then, virtual currencies, do we know much about it? No, it's very volatile. We know that, right? But do we fully understand how it works? There's certain companies that do, but not all of us. I think, broadly speaking, financial crime has to get better at it, learn it better, so that we can also police it better.
I just wanted to round off with some like easier, lighter questions. What is like the biggest surprise you've had about when working in sanctions? Like for instance, a name on a list.
When we're talking about like the webs of sometimes that you see, right? Something that's not specifically sanctioned, but could be sanctioned because of their relationship. So I never knew that there were I think it's two buildings in the United States that are actually owned by the Iranian government. One of them is in New York City. I think the address is 650 Fifth Avenue. It's technically owned by the Alavi Foundation, but who are the owners? The Iranian government. So I think if you Google it, you could find out that there's been many court cases where the United States has tried to kind of take over ownership of that building based on that ownership structure. Still, the courts are not allowing it, but I was pretty shocked with all the issues we have with Iran that they actually own property in the United States.
Yeah, I actually have a similar one just to kind of follow up on that. I remember I was just looking at Strise, at this company that we just had as a demo, a company that we demo when we show it to potential customers. And it suddenly had a flag that someone in North Korea owned a piece of it. So that was like something, I was like, is that even allowed? Is it possible? But apparently it was.
I guess the statement I wanted to make in the outset was that though I do work for Danske Bank and I know I represent them in a way because they're my employer, everything I'm sharing today is of my own opinion and no way reflects Danske Bank's policies or procedures.
And speaking of which, 2018 was kind of a big deal in terms of the big Danske Bank case.
So what led to the Danske Bank scandal? Like, what can you tell us on that?
Yeah, so I won't be able to get into much detail, but just to give you a high-level overview, the issue came up with a branch in Estonia that Danske Bank had that apparently had Russian oligarchs in their client portfolio. And apparently there was some money laundering going on with those clients that went unseen or maybe was overlooked. I don't know. That's debatable. But um, what I can say for sure is that, I've been with the bank for a little over a year, almost a year and a half. And the remediation that begun as part of that scandal is well underway. There's a article in the Wall Street Journal from our Chief Compliance Officer, Satnam Lehal, that he goes into more detail on the remediation process that's ongoing and about halfway done. So yeah, I would encourage those who are listening to go look up that article by our Chief Compliance Officer to get more specifics on how we're cleaning up that quote unquote scandal. But yeah, a lot of remediation has happened. And what I think, my personal views is that that kind of put a spotlight on the Nordics, right? They've been
Mm.
kind of untouched, right? We saw a lot of sanctions issues in the US, throughout Europe. Not so much in the Nordics. I think now, which is a big reason why I'm in Copenhagen now, right? Danske Bank has brought in a lot of expats because of regulatory exposure. I think you're going to start seeing that trickle through the rest of the region over time and see other banks being evaluated and quite frankly getting in trouble as well. I mean, that's just the name
Mm.
of the game. No banks are doing 100% what they need to do. So you're going to see, I think, a lot of other banks ramping up their compliance programs because they know their local competent authorities are being educated in this, and it's all stemming from this scandal.
So, just like a fun fact on that, how many billions do you think Danske Bank has spent on compliance and solving this since?
I'll just say 10 billion.
Is that US dollars or DKK or an NOK?
USD. My mind always
Mm.
still works in USD. Let's say that.
No, I'm not sure. We'll have to check up later.
Yeah,
Or did
yeah.
you check already,
I thought you
Frederick?
had a number. I was like ready to see if I got it right or I was close.
No, I think
Yeah.
it's approximately 1/10 according to our source. But people
Yeah.
out there, please do fact check this. This is
Maybe we should ask the chief compliance officer to join the laundry and
Yeah.
verify. Or
There you
that
go.
would be great episode.
maybe that should be our goal, getting him on board once. Just rounding off, like at Strise, I have my t-shirt on here, decision maker, it says, for those who are watching and not just
Nice.
listening. But that's like our ambition or, vision as well to, use technology to turn the people working with this into like better decision maker. So just to finish off, have you an example where like data or technology helped you to make a better decision in your work?
I mean, you could go for a simple example is that, when I was doing transaction monitoring at the Chinese bank, I was using Company House to try to figure out who the owner of a company was, and it just listed the director. So out of curiosity, because I could find nothing else out on that um, for the owner, I was like, let me Google the director's name. And lo and behold, there was an article about him and his wife who were known for setting up shell companies and selling it off for nefarious activity. So that was one fun fact on just
Maybe we
doing
should ask
open
the
source
Chinese
research.
bank to. Maybe we should ask the Chinese bank then to use Strise, because that would be a flagged automatically in Strise.
Yeah.
Thank you for joining our podcast. We might have to do a follow-up episode on the Russia-Ukraine situation once we know more. So thanks a lot. And if you're listening and want to come on the podcast and talk about compliance and AML, please don't hesitate to reach out to us.
Appreciate you taking the time.
No, thank you guys for inviting me.
Yeah, money make a